Territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on Wednesday, April the 10th, 2024, the committee is meeting to commence its study of tax revenues from businesses on First Nations territories. I think you all know the rules regarding audio feedback and the hybrid format, so I just want to go right to our panel because we are a little behind. There will be, if the committee approves it, a small change. Canada Border Service Agency, which is scheduled currently to appear in the second panel with the Canada Revenue Agency, they've asked to be moved to the first panel to sit with this panel. Do I have any objections to that change? Okay, perfect. So we will add Finance, Justice, Border Services, and Revenue Agency all in panel number 1. And with that, I wish to say good morning to our witnesses and just give them a quick second to set up here. Also, we will start with the Department of Finance first, then go to Justice, then Border Services, then CRA for their testimony. Are you okay to start while they're setting up? You're okay? Okay, I believe it's Leslie Taylor you're going to be speaking, the Director General of Intergovernmental Tax Policy for the Department of Finance. Thank you very much, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and honourable members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for having us here. Nous vous remercions de nous donner l'occasion de nous présenter.
We would like to thank you for giving us the opportunity of appearing today concerning the committee's study examining tax revenues on First Nation lands and how they might be placed under the control of First Nations themselves or better directed to increase resources that are available to First Nations.
As officials from the Tax Policy Branch of the Department of Finance, we provide analysis, research, and advice to the Minister of Finance on the Government of Canada's tax policy agenda. In the area of Indigenous tax policy, we are responsible for the negotiation and implementation of tax-related arrangements with interested Indigenous groups and the day-to-day operations of these arrangements. We'd be happy to discuss the current government policies and priorities related to Indigenous tax jurisdiction, but just, however, we are not going to be in a position to speculate about future government policy. Mr. Chair, part of a fair fiscal relationship means supporting Indigenous tax jurisdiction in a way that advances self-determination while also generating important revenues for community priorities. The federal government encourages and works with interested Indigenous governments to exercise direct tax powers. Taxation by Indigenous governments can help strengthen self-reliance while promoting good governance and political accountability between these governments and their citizens. It also makes the tax landscape in Canada more uniform. Aujourd'hui, nous avons conclu.
Today, we have over 50 sales and personal income tax administration agreements with Indigenous governments across Canada. And this has delivered about $70 million in revenues to those taxing governments in the last fiscal year.
A few of the key tax jurisdiction frameworks. First is the First Nations Goods and Services Tax, also known as the FNGST, facilitated under the First Nations Goods and Services Tax Act. The FNGST is a tool that enables Indigenous governments to voluntarily impose a broad-based value-added tax on their own lands within their reserves or settlement lands. Under their own laws within their reserve or settlement lands. This tax is fully harmonized with the federal GST, or in the case of the harmonized provinces, the federal component of the harmonized sales tax. Les groupes intéressés peuvent choisir.
Interested groups can choose to implement the tax when it is right for them through negotiated tax administration agreements between the federal government and interested Indigenous governments.
Everyone pays the FNGST where it applies, that is, members of the Indigenous community as well as non-members, and the rules of the FNGST are aligned with the GST. The FNGST is administered by the Canada Revenue Agency free of charge, and Indigenous governments can use the revenues received through this framework as they see fit. I'd like to stress that in this way, the exercise of tax powers can be an important means for Indigenous governments to generate their own independent revenues. Indigenous government tax revenues are not federal transfer funds or Indian monies under the Indian Act, and accordingly, Indigenous governments have the discretion to apply tax revenues to their own priorities. The FNGST Act also facilitates the imposition of provincial-type direct taxes between willing provinces and territories and Indigenous governments. Second, and building on the principles of the FNGST framework, Budget 2024 proposes to provide additional flexibility to Indigenous governments seeking to exercise tax jurisdiction on their lands. Plus précisément, il est proposé que les gouvernements autochtones
Specifically, it is proposed that Indigenous governments would be able to enact a value-added sales tax under their own laws only on fuel, alcohol, cannabis, tobacco, and or vaping products, which are referred to as FACT, F-A-C-T products, within their reserves or settlement lands.
Sales tax would be analogous to the FNGST, including applying at the same 5% GST rate, but would be limited to fuel, alcohol, cannabis, tobacco, and vaping products. For some communities, taxing these goods may be preferable to taxing the broad base of goods under the FNGST. I'd like to acknowledge the development of the proposed framework has been the result of extensive engagement with and work by Indigenous partners since we began this process in 2022. In the near term, the focus will be on finalizing the relevant legislation to enable the FACT framework, as well as to continue working with Indigenous communities interested in implementing this new tool. In addition to these value-added frameworks, the government has several personal income tax arrangements in place with self-governing Indigenous groups and remains open to negotiating more agreements along with facilitating similar arrangements between interested Indigenous governments and provincial and territorial governments. For the most part, the existing tools for Indigenous jurisdiction are focused on direct taxation, where revenues raised on the Indigenous lands are linked to incidents within those lands. That is, that the tax is ultimately borne by the individuals living or consuming on those lands. En conclusion, le gouvernement fédéral
In conclusion, the federal government remains committed to negotiating mutually beneficial tax agreements with interested Indigenous governments.
Self-determination through revenues that Indigenous governments can invest in what matters most to their communities. Again, thank you for the invitation to appear here today. I'm here with two colleagues, Adam and Jack, and we appreciate any questions or discussion to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Taylor. We now go to the Department of Justice and Mr. Robert Brookfield. 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to participate in your study. I'm here for the Department of Justice because the Criminal Code anchors federal legislative engagement in gaming by providing the space for provinces and territories to conduct and manage that activity. Indigenous access to revenue from gaming can be an element of economic reconciliation. While the present legal structure gives flexibility to provinces and territories to determine appropriate models for this issue with Indigenous peoples, we recognize that some would prefer a different legal structure. And that may form part of your consideration on this issue. I'm not in a position to express a view on any alternatives, but I hope to provide you with information to assist you. Je donnerai un aperçu de l'évolution.
I will provide an overview of how gaming regulation has evolved in Canada over time, as well as a snapshot of the current regulatory framework as it relates to Indigenous peoples. Legislating against gaming under English law dates back to the 14th century. The Parliament of Canada, following those traditions, first adopted general prohibitions against gaming in the Criminal Code in 1892. In 1969, the Criminal Code was amended to allow the federal government, along with provincial governments, to conduct and manage lottery schemes. However, this resulted in a system that created competition and conflict between the federal and provincial lottery systems. To resolve that conflict, the federal government entered into an agreement with the provinces in which the federal government agreed to withdraw from the sale of lottery tickets and provincial governments agreed to provide yearly payments to the federal government in exchange. The agreement with the provinces, finalized in 1985, is reflected in Section 207 of the Criminal Code. The only aspect of gaming that the federal government continued to exercise regulatory control over is horse racing. Otherwise, provinces and territories were left to create regulatory frameworks for gaming within the broad discretion that the Criminal Code provided.
The existing framework stayed largely the same until 2021, when former Bill C-218 amended the Criminal Code and removed the prohibition against single-event sports betting. As a result, provincial and territorial governments gained the ability to include single-event sports betting in their gaming regimes. Throughout the federal legislative history of gaming in Canada, Indigenous governments were not substantially engaged or consulted, nor were they given any federal legislative authority to conduct and manage gaming on their lands. The Criminal Code vests that authority solely with provincial and territorial governments. Provinces and territories have either generally provided some scope for Indigenous governments to be directly involved in gaming or to receive economic benefits from the resulting revenue. But the extent of the involvement varies across jurisdictions. Many provinces have authorized Indigenous governments, or entities that they control, to operate some casinos and other forms of gaming and to retain the profits. Some other provinces have revenue sharing agreements for gaming revenue. While the ability of Indigenous governments to exercise regulatory control over gaming operations varies, ultimate legal control under the Criminal Code rests with the provinces. The inability of Indigenous governments in the present legislative structure to operate independently is, understandably, a source of dissatisfaction to some. As the committee is likely aware, Bill S-268 was introduced in the Senate by Senator Scott Tanis in June 2023. The bill proposes to amend the Criminal Code to permit a governing body of a First Nation to conduct and manage a lottery scheme on that First Nation's reserve, effectively giving the same jurisdictional powers as the province. The bill is currently at second reading. Outre le projet de loi S-268,
Apart from Bill S-268, there have been calls for reform by various Indigenous governments. For example, the Mohawk Council of Kanawake, which operates the Kanawake Gaming Commission within its territory, has openly called for reform. Although, as mentioned, many Indigenous governments share in gaming revenue from the provinces, we recognize the benefits that increased participation and revenue could provide. In the United Nations Declaration Act Action Plan, the federal government has committed to advancing discussions on the participation of Indigenous peoples across Canada in the gaming industry and its regulation, collaboratively with provincial and territorial partners. While those discussions have not yet led to clear forward paths, we are hopeful we can look to a more collaborative future. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that, and coming in under time as well. We are going now to Canada Border Services. All good. And I believe it is Ms. Laflamme, the Director of Trade Policy. Is that who's speaking for CB? No? Okay. All right. See, Border Agency has no opening remarks, so we're going to break to Canada Revenue Agency. And I'm not sure which one would like to speak, so
I'll try.
Please.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, membre du comité. Je m'appelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Isabelle Brault. I'm the Director General of the Legislative Policy Directorate, Legislative Policy and Regulatory Affairs Branch at the Canada Revenue Agency. I have my colleague Aliou Diarra who is with me, and I'd like to start by thanking you for inviting us to your meeting. To set a helpful context for the discussions today, I'd like to briefly describe the role of the Canada Revenue Agency in the administration of the Excise Tax Act relative to that of other federal organizations. As you are aware, the Department of Finance is responsible for developing and evaluating the federal tax policy and the legislation through which policy becomes law. The Canada Revenue Agency is responsible for the functions which implement these laws, and these include the following: providing information to the public and stakeholders, establishing processes through which individuals and businesses may meet their tax obligations and receive benefits, and, of course, carrying out compliance activities to help ensure that everyone respects the law as it was intended by Parliament. The role of the Canada Revenue Agency is to interpret the Excise Tax Act as it is worded. I can therefore speak about the application of the legislation. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the remarks here from our witnesses. We are now going to start with the first round of questioning, and that begins with the Conservative Party with Martin Shields for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nice to see you in the chair. Thank you for our witnesses to being here today. Appreciate it. The First Nations Tax Commission, are you aware of the First Nations Tax Commission? I assume that's Ms. Taylor.
Yes, absolutely.
So their proposal for First Nations resource charge, are you familiar with their proposal?
Yeah, in high-level terms, yes, we have met with them and we have heard presentations from them about the proposal.
So you're very familiar with how it works now on First Nations in the sense of resource sectors, whatever resource, there's fees that they can charge for different things of accessing the land. But this goes farther in wanting to access the revenue stream that comes from those resources.
That's my understanding, yes.
So do you have any response to that particular proposal?
Yeah, Yeah, I think what I'd say is we're in really early stages. Budget 2024 did indicate the government's openness to continuing to discuss ways that First Nations and Indigenous groups can benefit from resource development on their lands. That would certainly encompass the main proposal we've heard from the FNTC. We have a close relationship with the FNTC, and we have met with them, and we continue to do so. It's a little premature for me to speak to views on that, but there is an awareness and a continuing engagement with them on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned was, in the sense of taxing, was linked only to nations' lands. So are you suggesting that if they developed a tax, it would only apply to people who lived on the nation?
Well, typically, if you're talking about a band, they would have, reserve lands or other lands. If you're talking about a group post-treaty, they'll have settlement lands, which could extend beyond, the traditional reserve lands. So tax, when a government imposes this, an Indigenous government imposes it, would apply on those lands. Typically, under the frameworks we have, it applies to both members of the community and non-members. So an example of the FNGST, both Indigenous community members and non-members would pay if they were making a purchase of a good or a service on the lands.
And I understand that concept, but when we go to municipal government, for example, you may not live in that municipality, but you are taxed in various ways from that municipality. So are you saying that the First Nations wouldn't have that ability?
Well, in terms of the boundaries of their lands, if they've entered into one of these tax arrangements, then they would tax the entirety of the activities within those lands. If you're talking about members of the community, are you talking about members of the community that would be living outside of the boundaries? Yeah, so those are not, the frameworks at this time do not permit taxation of members living outside of the community.
But yet, under the structures of our other forms of government, you can be taxed, but you're limiting them.
So if a member of an Indigenous community, for example, moved, to a different province and was habitating there, they would be subject to, potentially subject to, say, provincial or federal taxes. That's right. Now, there's a little bit of a nuance if they're moving to a different reserve lands, and then Section 87 exemptions may apply, but that sort of depends on the circumstances of the individual.
And the reason I bring it up, it just seems like a limiting factor when you say it compared to the other levels of government we have, that it restricts in the sense of what their capacity to do.
I think if you compare it to, say, provincial taxes, those would apply within, obviously, the boundaries of the province. Municipalities similarly would apply within their municipal, property boundaries. So it's a similar type concept there. In some instances.
You can tax beyond your boundaries, both provincially and municipally. You can do that.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about the funding, are you talking about taxing on people or taxing on land, their ability?
So the frameworks we have in place today include a First Nations personal income tax, which would be analogous to the federal personal income tax regime. The FNGST, which is analogous to the goods and services tax. And then there are property tax regimes which are not under our area of responsibility, but those are also applicable as well for interested governments.
So the ability for an Indigenous nation to charge taxes on property within their nation is available to them?
That's right. So they can access that through either provisions under the Indian Act or through the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. There are two different approaches to getting at levying a property tax, but they are available to do that, yeah.
Usually to do that, you have to have title for a person to be able to be taxed on that property.
Yeah.
Can people have title on a nation to property?
Well, it gets into whether there's the characterization of the lands, if it's fee simple or not. I think it would depend on the specific instances. Yeah.
Are you familiar with any nations that have fee simple on their nation land?
There are definitely First Nations taxing, levying a property income tax, property tax on their lands. It's, again, a little area of our area expertise. I wouldn't want to provide you with the wrong details about that. So, yeah.
Is there a cap on the goods and services tax? Is there a cap?
I think what you may be referring to is the revenue sharing mechanism. Yeah. So there is a mechanism that takes into account when a group is levying a GST, the FNGST. If the bulk of the revenues are coming from taxing of non-members, so an individual, say, passing through a reserve land and making a purchase there, but they're not actually a member of the committee or the community, if the bulk of the revenues is coming from that stream of taxation, then yes, there can be a cap that kicks in some instances that's embedded in the formula and the agreements that we have with
Okay,
governments.
thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. Shields. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I apologize. That was the end of your 6 minutes. So next we go to the Liberal Party and Mr. Pawlowski for 6 minutes, please.
We're just embarking on this study, and frankly, I certainly don't know all the taxes that do and do not apply in First Nations communities. I also know that some taxes too, that if you have a status card, even if you're not in the community, you don't have to pay tax on certain things. And I don't know the relevant legislation as to what creates and what removes the taxes. So I know this may be fairly laborious, but can somebody kind of run through which taxes people do and don't have to pay on First Nations land? For example, like income tax?
Yeah. So thank you for the question, and it is complex. So a really fair question to ask. So Section 87 of the Indian Act establishes an exemption from tax for the property, and I'll use the word of the Indian, as that's the word used in the Act, on reserve. So that 87 exemption applies to, and a lot of this has come from the interpretation of the courts over the years. Applies to income, applies to, if you were a sole proprietor of a business generating income on reserve, that can be exempt. It also applies to the GST, HST.
If the income's generated on reserve, but how about if you drive off reserve and you have a job off reserve, then that's subject to tax?
Yeah, so that's where we get into what's called the connecting factors test. And essentially what we're saying there is looking at the specific situation of the taxpayer and trying to determine is their business income largely related to activities on reserve, connected to the reserve, and therefore would fall under that umbrella of the 87 exemption? Or are there factors like, as you said, they're driving off reserve every day, conducting business, it's not connected back to the reserve at all, and therefore there's a question about whether the 87 exemption would apply. I don't want to put CRA colleagues on the spot, but I think if that's a fair characterization, then you want to add? No. These connecting factors have to be...
Does that mean like every single taxpayer, when they make money, has to kind of personally go through some kind of hoops to show that money was either related to living on reserve or not?
CRA, do you want to speak to the process at all? Or?
So thank you for the question. Effectively, we have some validation process in place in CRA to ensure the exemption nature of the revenue. So we have different type of mechanisms in place to ensure that.
Okay. Now, is this a lengthy procedure? I have headaches enough when I pay taxes. I kind of thinking, well, if you had this other loophole that you have to now prove that it's related to living on reserve, is that a burdensome thing for the applicant? Now, you may not see it quite like the person on the other side sees it, but...
So what is clear is that we should not underestimate the complexity of those particular situations, but I don't know enough about the overall kind of experience by all the taxpayers, but we have in place resources and people that are trained to be able to effectively determine the eligibility of those income.
If the person lives on reserve, makes the money on reserve, but then doesn't live on reserve, do they pay tax? So I know in Thunder Bay, and there's, for example, I think there's like 7 or 8 gas stations in Fort William First Nations. A lot of people go over there to buy gas. I think a fair number of the people working there aren't from the community. If they're making money there, do they pay tax or no on income tax?
a very good question, but if I can give you the example of the personal income tax agreement that Leslie mentioned. And in those territories, when the government, indigenous government decide, to enter in those agreements, the member or the citizen of this community pay their taxes, but these taxes are remitted to the governing bodies. So in this particular situation, every participant in those communities pay their taxes, but it's remitted to our process to the government.
Okay, so if you're not First Nations, you do pay the tax, but then the First Nations community, but they're not obliged though to collect income tax. They only choose to.
In the context of those agreements, like non-status member.
These are the ones we heard. There was like 80 communities or something that had agreements.
Exactly, 15. We have 15 type of personal income tax agreement. So in those agreements, like indigenous people or non-indigenous people have to pay the taxes as in the normal situation, but all the revenue collected, are remitted to the indigenous government to finance Canada mechanism.
And if there is no such agreement, then they don't collect tax at all.
So if we take the particular situation of a reserve, for example, and when there is no agreement, the indigenous people with the status, the Indian status, have the exemption, the tax exemption. So they may fill the return, but ultimately they may not pay taxes because they are exempted from taxes.
Okay. And if you're non-Indigenous and you're working on the reserve, same thing?
No.
You what?
You would remit tax to Canada?
Oh, you do. You still have to pay tax. Okay, because it's only under the Indian Act, it's only people who have status who don't have to pay on reserve. Okay, so how about for GST, PST on reserve? They're just, because you talked about giving First Nations communities the ability to collect that money for
Just a
for
quick
themselves.
answer on this one.
But right now, it's not collected?
Yeah, you're about 30 seconds over, but if you want to quickly answer.
Sure. So in absence of an FNGST agreement, then the individuals who are status individuals would be Section 87 exempt from paying the GST with respect to purchases on the reserve land. When an agreement is in place, then the taxing Indigenous government has said, I'm going to tax both my members, and then under the agreement would be taxing the non-members as well. So any consumption taking place on the lands, there's a share of the revenues are flowing to the Indigenous government that's taxing.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And to our Bloc Québécois friends, 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Félicitations.
Thank you, Chair. Congratulations for your leadership and for your role today. My question will be for everyone, probably, and let's see who would be best placed to answer. So one of the issues that is very common in Indigenous communities, in some cases it is a result of the Indian Act, and we're seeing that many Indigenous people, especially the older generations, are against one certain thing. So the system, and I'm just trying to understand, but the system seems to be built in such a way where it is on to the communities themselves, the responsibility, I mean, to determine the property tax or other taxes that could be paid by the people living there. But if they are taxed on reserve, and then there have been decisions of the federal government which put an end to their traditional way of living. Some of these Indigenous individuals believe that it is legitimate to behave in this way because it's not them who decided to live on those lands. But the problem here for me is that the obligation is put on the shoulders of the community itself to go and find this income, without which they will not have any income, which is, of course, necessary for the development of their own communities. So putting the burden on the shoulders of the Indigenous communities and band councils, this decision of the federal government, I mean, isn't it asking too much? Or is it really in this way that the system functions? Thank you for your question. I'll be answering in English because it's quite technical.
One thing that I stressed a few times is that these are voluntary arrangements. It is not something imposed on any group at any time. If there is an interest, and I think one of the things we try and ensure is that there's sufficient outreach with communities and through important organizations like the FNTC, the First Nations Tax Commission, that can help to be a resource for communities that want to understand their options. You know, if they'd like to enter into these agreements, there's many, opportunities to meet, to discuss, to either go to us directly, or if they feel more comfortable through an Indigenous-led organization working with a group like the FNTC, to get information about what's available. It is a big decision whether to implement a tax regime. I won't downplay that. That is, a big decision that a community has to come to through its own discussions, its own priorities, its own values. We're there to be a resource. We're there to help explain. I think, but I do acknowledge that it is a big decision and big, considerations need to go into whether to tax or not. In terms of setting up an actual tax regime, there are many pre-existing models that are used. So I spoke about the FNGST. That's applied on the same basis as the GST rules. The CRA administers free of charge. So in terms of the burden on the community itself, because we're looking at a harmonized regime with administrative support, there's help along the way. It's not that they have to take on the administration themselves.
Dans le contexte de la
In the current context of housing crisis, which of course dearly impacts First Nations, one of the issues at stake is the issue that there is no access to housing due to partly to obstacles to accessing capital. How can this situation be reversed to allow First Nations to have access to ownership? Is this something that is being worked on through the different aspects of reconciliation? It would probably require going back into the Indian Act and looking into something that will be a bit more substantial in terms of negotiations, and maybe it will also take longer to finalize.
Yeah, in terms of financing, I don't think anyone at this table is best positioned to answer those questions. Our area is a bit more niche than that. Certainly, I know you have some of our federal colleagues from CERNA and ISK coming in the second hour of this appearance. They, not to put them on the spot, but they may have some better information about the financing issue, because certainly it's a known issue, is how to ensure that a fair approach to overcoming some of the traditional barriers that have been there to development in terms of accessing financing. It's a known issue, and I know there's groups within the government working on it.
What's the difference in application when it comes to collecting taxes? If we're talking about a territory that is Indigenous but it's not recognized as reserve, does that give different departments additional powers, or does it create additional complexity or challenges in terms of getting the taxation done correctly?
So I think it's important that if you're going back to the Section 87 exemption, that applies and clearly is delineated as applying on the reserve lands, or in the case of Indigenous governments that are post-treaty, it would be the lands, reserve lands at the date of signing of the treaty, so just prior to entering into treaty. Now, that sort of Section 87 exemption there obviously carries with it an exemption from tax, but groups can choose to tax there. But post-treaty, what you're talking about is the settlement lands, which can be much broader than the treaty lands prior to, the reserve lands prior to treaty. So you're not bound by those lands when you're opting into a tax framework. So yeah, there are different treatments that flow out of whether it was designated as reserve land or not.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That is about 30 seconds over, but I appreciate the timing. That's okay. Ms. Idlout, you now have 6 minutes. Thank you so much.
Yan na may udla ko inuktong niya ka makawya makawasi to sa jute may atong negit ko si voldang met ilon na sinay to met kiyon na ko si.
Mr. Chair.
Sorry, Ms. Idlout. We don't have translation yet.
Thank you. I will be speaking Inuktitut. And if you could respond to me very briefly, since we don't have much time. Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming here. What we are discussing today needs a lot of improvement, needs a lot of reworking. Firstly, I will ask if you could all respond, if it's your responsibility. Canada has a reconciliation policy with Indigenous peoples, the federal government, and its various departments. How does it affect your department, this reconciliation strategy and plan that you have with Indigenous peoples? Leslie, if you would go first, and then Robin, and then Isabel, in that order.
Reconciliation for us within the tax policy branch, within the Indigenous government's area, really I think is about ensuring that we can do everything we can to support and work with partners to advance the agenda of taxation.
I apologize. Maybe I wasn't clear. I will ask again. Reconciliation is a very important thing. Where did the directive come from to work on reconciliation? We know that there is a universal United Nations rights of the indigenous peoples. Are you aware of that?
Certainly provides us with a framework and with guidelines, absolutely, that legislation to undertake to meet all the terms of the legislation, absolutely.
I'd say similar. Our department implements the United Nations Declaration Implementation Act, so it's very important for us. We have units that deal with this specifically, and as I mentioned with respect to gaming, there is the unit that deals with unit implementation. We deal with our unit quite regularly with in the context of number 78, which deals specifically with gaming. There's some other elements that are, for example, for sterilization, which is another one that's important in relation to criminal justice. So they have a whole mechanism for reaching out to us on those particular issues, and obviously they reach out within the Department of Justice and more broadly to try and address those issues. I also say that, for me at least, and I think for our department, reconciliation is not just about implementation. That's one mechanism that's dealing with particular rights, but I would say that every initiative we take on is informed by a desire to advance reconciliation, although not always as far as we might like to do.
Thank you. I can add to that for the Canada Revenue Agency is aware of the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, and we, as a department, also are contributing to the implementation of the UNDA Act, the Speed Action Plan. For us, given our mandate, the focus is really in continue to build trust, to engage with Indigenous partners, but also to customize our services so that they can suit the particular circumstance of the indigenous people.
Thank you. The United Nations Indigenous Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, regarding that, I heard that in your department, if you could respond, Robert, firstly, how do you plan to implement the rights of the indigenous peoples under UN? How do you plan to implement that here? Thank you.
As I mentioned, a unit within the Department of Justice that implements the United Nations Declaration Act action plan. So there's a number of items, as I mentioned, 2 specific to the criminal law justice that we deal with. They reach out more generally. They have broad processes to try and track what's going on. I wouldn't say I can say today or perhaps ever in detail what's going to happen with each of them. I should also highlight that there is separately but related an Indigenous Justice Program strategy that the government is the Department of Justice is leading on. That's being involved, and again, another unit, but they are going out to very many communities across Canada to try to see what could be done, particularly in the justice space, including criminal law, but not just limited to that.
Okay. Lastly, if you could all respond separately regarding reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. When you work with Indigenous peoples in Canada, how do you speak? Do you speak their language? Do you follow their code guidelines, or do you use? Or if you find that their policies and value systems are different from the federal government's, how do you work it out that you are able to work together?
Yeah, so with respect to language, unfortunately, I am not, I speak English and French, but not beyond that. So I think we would rely on interpreters as necessary, and trying to ensure, I think, especially with Canada Revenue Agency, that there's more and more available in a variety of languages with respect to the tax system so that people can...
I'm sorry, that was still 30 seconds over. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about languages, unfortunately.
I'm sorry. I did purposely let everyone go about 30 seconds over. As you noticed, everyone got the same. The reason being is because we did start 10 minutes late, and we expect bells around 12:30, it's my understanding. So if the committee is okay with it, maybe we wrap up this round and get into the second hour, if that's okay with everyone, unless people, if I see thumbs up, we're okay with that? Okay, and then we'll get into the second round because we will have a short period of time there too. So, okay, thank you to our witnesses. We'll briefly suspend while we set up for the next panel. We appreciate your contributions and appreciate everything that's been going on here. So we'll briefly suspend. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we set up for panel 2 on our study. We will have limited time because, like I said earlier, we do expect bells. But before we get to the witnesses, I just want to deal with something the NDP brought to my attention, and I seek the committee's guidance on this. Ms. Idlout was wondering, because her question was not answered, the interpretation was probably not understood entirely to our witnesses. So Ms. Idlout is wondering if she can resubmit her question to the witnesses and her witnesses then provide a written statement. Does anyone have any issue with that? Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone. Okay, we are going to go to our second panel of witnesses. We have, I think, the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs is going to kick things off. I think someone's working on their... It's okay, take your time. Oh, you want to go to the other one first? Who wants to go first? Mr. Wright? It's all you.
Okay.
You have
Hello.
5 minutes.
Merci. Hello, my name is Rob Wright, Associate Deputy Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting me, along with my colleague, Christopher Duchesne, Director General, responsible for Indigenous institutions and governance modernization, to participate in this important study on taxation revenue and economic reconciliation. Before beginning, I want to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We welcome the opportunity to participate in the committee study and to outline how Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada is working collaboratively with First Nations to support them in shaping their economic future. But of course, we're not doing this work alone with First Nations. While we support the First Nations Tax Commission and the other institutions of the First Nations Fiscal Management Act, Finance Canada, as you saw, is the lead department on taxation, and their leadership and collaborative work in this space is critical. Similarly, colleagues at Indigenous Services Canada and from the previous hour, the Department of Justice and other departments play vitally important roles. Historically, through colonial systems and structures, the federal government actively impeded the ability of Indigenous peoples to participate in and contribute to Canada's economy. Today, we recognize those harms and their long-term negative impacts, and CERNAC, along with other federal departments, is working to renew our relationship, support Indigenous self-determination, and the full participation of Indigenous peoples in Canada's economy. One way we're doing this is through the First Nations Fiscal Management Act and the 4 independent First Nations-run fiscal institutions, which provide First Nations with support and tools to strengthen their communities and build their economies. First Nations choose whether to participate in and to leverage authorities under the Act. Almost 2/3 of First Nations are now scheduled to the Act, with many of them taking full advantage of these economic tools. Now, while all First Nations can pass bylaws related to the taxation of land under Section 83 of the Indian Act, the Fiscal Management Act provides First Nations with authorities similar to those of municipal governments in the areas of financial management, property taxation, and local revenues, as well as financing for infrastructure, economic, and social development. To date, 160 First Nations have enacted property taxation laws under this Act, and another 27 are taxing land use under Section 83 of the Indian Act, collecting almost $125 million annually. Taxation allows First Nations to collect stable local revenues from land uses such as agricultural permits and leases, oil, gas, and timber leases, commercial and residential leases, and utilities. First Nations then choose how to invest these revenues according to their own priorities. Ce n'est qu'un exemple parmi d'autres.
This is only one example that goes to show that the communities are taking ownership of their future. Before the implementation of the Fiscal Management Act in 2006, the governments of First Nations did not have access to affordable and long-term capital, as do other governments. As a result of the historical barriers of the Indian Act, they had to deal with extremely high interest rates and banks were reticent to do business. Today, the situation is quite different. Communities are exercising powers pursuant to the Act, and they have been able to benefit from more than $2 billion in loans from the First Nations Financial Authority. These loans are used to develop their communities, which is the definition of economic self-determination. Moreover, these communities are doing better in terms of community well-being.
Authorities and supports are advancing reconciliation, self-determination, and socio-economic development in First Nations, in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. A living example of this was the co-development with Indigenous partners of amendments to the Fiscal Management Act, Bill C-45, which passed Parliament just last June. This collaborative approach is also consistent with the government's commitment to modern treaties and self-government arrangements, which cover over 40% of Canada's landmass. They establish relationships between the Crown and Indigenous peoples and provide Indigenous governments with the ability to generate revenue through direct taxes. Mr. Chair, the full inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the economy could mean tens of billions of growth to Canada's GDP. For example, a recent report from the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chiefs found that Indigenous economies had a direct contribution of $3.6 billion in 2020 to the Atlantic economy alone. Malgré les progrès accomplis,
Sorry, Mr.
il
Wright,
reste
you're about
beaucoup à
40
faire
seconds
et
over
nous
if you want to wrap up.
continuerons à soutenir les Premières Nations.
We will continue to support First Nations, Métis and Inuit on the path to self-determination and economic prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to rush you there. Sorry. I didn't know how much you had left. Okay. I do have Indigenous Services up next. I don't know which one is going to go, so I'll pass the floor to whoever wants to speak.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Ah, oui. Okay. Thank you. I, too, would also like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. My name is Michelle. I'm the Associate Deputy Minister, Indigenous Services Canada, and I'm joined by my colleague Jessica Salton in a very tangled earpiece, who is the Director General of our Economic Policy and Development branch. Aujourd'hui, je vais aborder la
Today I will talk about the way in which my department is following the examples of Indigenous leaders to get rid of systemic barriers standing in the way of self-determination.
Through supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs, enabling job creation in Indigenous communities, or helping ensure Indigenous peoples have access to the capital they need for equity in major projects is about making sure everyone has equitable access to economic opportunity. This will be achieved by supporting and responding to priorities brought forward by Indigenous leaders and taking responsible action to remove economic barriers, something we aspire to do at Indigenous Services Canada. I'd like to highlight really briefly some of the key programs that target economic development. Budget 2024, as you probably know, announced $350 million for the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program to continue to support Indigenous enterprises and help them access affordable capital. This investment will enable job creation and stimulate economic activity in Indigenous communities. The Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program is an additional tool to ensure that Indigenous communities have access to affordable capital in order to optimize Indigenous equity participation in major projects. We also have an initiative called the Strategic Partnerships Initiative, which builds capacity for Indigenous participation in economic development opportunities such as local, economically sustainable clean energy projects. Grâce à des partenariats avec plusieurs ministères.
Thanks to partnerships with many federal departments, the provincial and territorial governments, as well as non-federal partnerships and strategic partnership initiative are all coming together to fill in the loopholes and helping find additional financial resources to aid with the economic development of these communities.
Reconciliation by driving demand to Indigenous businesses via implementation of a requirement to ensure that at least 5% of the value of government contracts are awarded to businesses owned and controlled by Indigenous peoples, and by respecting modern treaties that include procurement obligations. And finally, the development of an economic reconciliation framework will unlock opportunities to advance self-determination and economic reconciliation by ensuring Indigenous peoples can meaningfully participate in and shape the decisions that make economic growth possible. Les peuples autochtones définiront le
Indigenous peoples will define their own economic objectives to put forward their vision of economic development.
economic reconciliation. A lot more work, but we're up for the task. Je suis heureuse de répondre à toutes vos questions.
I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our friends here at both CERNAC and Indigenous Services. I think we start with the we do start with the Conservatives next, and I think it is Mr. Shields for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the witnesses being here today. Mr. Wright, you probably heard me ask a question earlier, and I'll ask you the same one. When we talk about land that they have, are you aware of First Nations that have fee simple, actual individual land ownership on nations?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and I may in a moment turn this to my colleague at ISK who may have more details. But certainly, Mr. Shields, there's many examples of First Nations communities having ownership of land in fee simple.
Basis?
It's on an individual community First Nations basis. Absolutely, I can speak to Member 2 First Nation just outside of Sydney. I know for a fact that when they developed a hotel, they did that on fee simple land at the time. They later entered into a land code, which may have made that process a little more simpler, but at the time chose to do that through fee simple transaction. But Michelle, I don't know if there's more you would like to add.
Oops, I'm not sure I can add more than that, Robert, but clearly we can follow up if there's specific questions, sir.
Yeah, I think it's for economic development, it's one of the barriers out there is we as individuals under our structure can get mortgages, we can borrow, we can get that. That has been an economic barrier in a sense for Indigenous people that barrier has been there because they haven't been able to have title fee simple to actual property to gain that. And so I think that's something you're suggesting is now beginning to happen.
I can say that, sir, and as certainly one thing we're seeing is that sometimes communities are wanting to add to reserve, which is a process that we work between both of our departments. But in some instances, they prefer to purchase land and hold it in fee simple.
Thank you. With your department, when you talk about funding, is it grant-based, yearly grant-based that we're talking about? Your department, when you're talking about economic development, you're talking about $350 million. Is it grant-based? It's grant application, yearly grant application?
Yeah, the vast majority of it, so the $350 million Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program is a contribution. In this case, it is with the National Aboriginal Partnerships Corporation, who then doles out the money to 58 independent Indigenous financial institutions who in turn work directly with communities to help individual entrepreneurs, Indigenous entrepreneurs and communities obtain loans for businesses. So from our perspective, it's a contribution.
One of the challenges of grant-based and having talked with economic development in a number of nations, the application process to find the grant, to secure the grant, to get it to the grassroots, to where an audit may occur, which obviously doesn't, and then it's to start over here again. They're saying it just doesn't work. The grant structure doesn't work because it just doesn't get to where it needs to get after many, many hours, days, weeks, months. It doesn't work.
So that is an issue that we are taking much notice of and working to modernize. I would note two specific undertakings. One is looking at the ability to potentially do multi-year funding, which would address that specific issue. The second is an ongoing, I'll call it a support in terms of more direct provision to communities or Indigenous entrepreneurs in the development of those grant proposals so that there's not as much administrative burden on each of the communities. That's further offset by the provision of economic development officers in the community. Ideally, one in each community is what we're working towards to support that type of work.
Thank you. At this time, Mr. Chair, I would like to move a motion. It's one that has been circulated. It's the motion, given that the appearance of the Minister's Indigenous Service, Minister of Northern Affairs, was delayed due to votes on Wednesday, May 22nd, 2024, pursuant to Standing Order 81-4, that the committee reinvites the Minister of Indigenous Services and Minister of Northern Affairs to appear separately for a minimum of 1 hour each to discuss the main estimates 2024-25, and this meeting be held no later than May 31st. That has been circulated and tabled, and I'm moving it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shields. I believe everyone has a copy of that motion. Now, for the committee's context, the clerk has informed me there's a few ways to go about this. So currently we have Minister Inanan in the first panel, and then we have Ministers Hajdu and Vandel for 30 minutes each in the second panel. Then we have the First Nations Tax Commission and I believe another witness for the third panel. So 3 hours on Wednesday. There are a few ways to do this. We could ask the Ministers Hajdu and Vandel to try, if it works in their schedule, to stay for the full hour, but in the same panel. The other option that was explained to me was to have each minister for 1 hour, because we have 3 hours each, depending on their schedules. I know their schedules do fill up. So I leave it up to the committee to determine how they wish to do that and how they wish to proceed. Any debate on this? Mr. Batiste.
Yes, I think it'd be great to get the ministers back. It was kind of a rushed intervention in committee because of the votes and whatnot. But we asked for their time for an hour. They were able to do a half hour. So for me to understand what's the relevance of them doing it a complete full hour as opposed to so that means that each minister's appeared for an hour and a half as opposed to an hour. Can we not just have them come back for one more round each and then we can get to the tax commission? Because I know there's things we also want to get to in terms of possible legislation that might be coming to us in June. So it's something that I just think that if we're going to be asking them to come back, fairness is, if they've done a half hour, that they should do another half hour. But to add another hour onto that, I just don't see the relevance with all the important things that we've got on the go.
Okay. Any other discussion? Mr. Melillo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate Mr. Shields bringing this forward. I think it's an important motion. We have a lot of members that have very important questions to ask of both these ministers. And to your question, Chair, about how we do this if passed, I would suggest we would just ask both Minister Hajdu and Minister Vandel to stay an extra hour, so we'd have the hour with Minister Inanan, the hour joint with Minister Hajdu and Vandel, and then the hour for the Tax Commission would be my suggestion, but of course that's predicated on the motion passing. Yeah, 3 hours, 3 hour meeting, which I believe is already scheduled. Okay. So I believe that's
Ms. Idlow?
I agree with Jaime and Eric. Get an hour for Gary. Hajdu and Vandel, half an hour on Wednesday. I believe that other invited guests we already had should be involved that day also. I wish to say also, if we can allow them extra time for those ministers, it is our responsibility to tell them as members of the parliament that we want them to spend an hour or a half hour to brief us. They have to respond to us and respond to our invitation.
Okay, so, Mr. Batiste?
No, I think you have what we would ask for Haidu and Vandel to maximize our time with them. They've already delivered opening comments, and so we can go straight into questions with them as opposed to having them do opening comments, and then we can maximize that hour that we have with them to potentially get maybe a round and a half each.
Okay, if that's acceptable to the committee? Okay. Everyone agreed? Okay, perfect. All right, the bells will ring, but I think there's agreement around the table to go into the bells so the Bloc and the NDP get their chance at questions. Okay, so I believe this now goes to the Bloc because the time, the Liberals.
No,
yes.
Mr. Chair, it goes to Mr. McLeod.
Sorry, Mr. McLeod, you were correct. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought you were going to skip me there. My comments, I think it's important that we take a look a little bit at our history as we move forward on the taxation issue, from the time the treaties were signed, from the time the Métis scripts were signed, the Indigenous governments were not allowed at the table to take part in the development of this country. I know certainly in the Northwest Territories, the Indigenous people really didn't have a seat at the decision-making table. And it also meant that there was really no avenue to generate revenues. And there was many barriers, in fact, to stop them from doing that. Now, as we move forward and are talking about reconstituting nations, as we're talking about working with Indigenous governments, Indigenous people to become self-governing, the issue of taxation is a very important one. The ability to finance self-governing nations and other governance models in Indigenous communities has to be based on the ability to finance their operations. And that means we need to get clarity on the ability to tax our own people as Indigenous governance. And, there's been discussion about arrangements viewed as grants or contribution agreements, but I think most Indigenous governments view this as the agreements to be along the same lines as provinces and territories are able to put a long-term formula financing arrangements together. So, there's no one funding source that's going to generate an Indigenous be able to generate enough revenues to fund an Indigenous government. So there has to be, many different sources utilized, and many would have to be part of the arrangement with the federal government. Royalties is also something that has to be considered. In the Northwest Territories, we already have resource revenue sharing agreements on some of the developments and renewable projects that are happening. But those things would all have to be taken into consideration and formed into a long-term, multi-year financing formula. And it's been a long time coming because for the 10 years that the Conservatives were in power, when Harper's government was in power, the approach from the Conservative government was that pretty much everything had to be through an OSR or own source revenues. And so there was no progress being made on some of the policies like the self-governing financing agreement that is now in place and will really help when it comes to clarity on what the federal government will be providing. However, there are still other barriers, and my first question will be on discussions that may be happening or maybe not happening, but let's use Northwest Territories, where I'm from, as an example. Any revenue agreement, especially on royalties or taxation of properties, of income tax that would be taken over by Indigenous governments, would mean revenues would drop for the government of Northwest Territories. So has any discussions happened with other jurisdictions, other governments that would be impacted?
Thank you very much for the question, and it's an important one, and I certainly don't want to freelance here, sir. So we could perhaps come back with a written response on that to make sure that we give you a comprehensive response in that area. Unless, Mr. Duchesne, you have anything to add? No? Okay. Michelle may have something for you, sir.
Oh, I appreciate very much the question and certainly agree with you. Certainly, the Indian Act and the years have effectively locked Indigenous people out of participating in the economy. And there are some things in place that are encouraging. My colleague Rob earlier mentioned, you can opt out of the Indian Act as part of the Fiscal Management Act and set up your own financial administration laws. You can opt out of the Indian Act if you're a First Nation and develop your own land code. These are certainly ways to create economic prosperity and other sources of revenue. But you're quite right, going forward, there needs to be a whole lot more. And I can say, as the government's commitment to developing an economic reconciliation framework, some of those discussions have already started. And the framework, the policy, the vision, and the actions will all be described by Indigenous peoples. It's they who are going to set their future, and they who are going to say what they need. And I think it's clear that revenue and economic prosperity and removing those things and barriers that are in the way of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people becoming prosperous will certainly be top of mind. And